Okay, so we're grouping by albums.album ID. So if we were to run this query inside of PHP My Admin, for example, let's click on the SQL tab and paste that into there. Let's go ahead and change this user ID here, because at the moment obviously MySQL wouldn't recognize it, and let's change it to 2 because my user ID is 2, and we can get a clear idea of how this query in here will actually work. Let's click on go. Okay, so images, okay, so I've made a slight error in the code. Let's just take a look where that would be. Okay, let's have a look at the error. Unknown column images dot albums albums ID I've put, so let's just, there we are, let's change that there, and then let's change that inside of here as well. Okay, so now our query should successfully run, so let's just click on go, and you can see the result of this. Now we've selected the album ID, the timestamp, the name, the description, and the image count of images that correspond to this album. As I showed you earlier, in images we take and we store the album ID that they belong in. So we've returned a field from a different table by using a left join. So hopefully this is more of a more graphical representation of what the left join does, and that's the long query that we use to obtain that value. So obviously if I had say 3 images uploaded, it would return a value of 3 just here. Okay, so now we need to actually loop through our results. So we use a while loop. You may have seen this used before, and we say albums row is equal to MySQL fetch assoc. So we're grabbing an associative array of the albums query, and inside here this will loop through for every result that we get. So if we had 3 albums, this loop would run 3 times and we could obtain the relevant information. Now we created an albums array up here, and we need to now add to that. So albums and brackets, we're going to add a value here, okay, and that value is another array. So we're creating a multi-dimensional array, which is an array within an array. Now we can pull this down to make everything look a bit neater, and we're going to create an associative array inside of here. So the first thing is ID, and we want that to equal albums row, not a semicolon, a comma, and that is album ID. Remember, we selected the album ID here. We're next going to select the timestamp, then the name, then the description, and the image count, and so on. Okay, so the next thing is the timestamp. So we want to grab the timestamp, and that's equal to albums row timestamp. Now this value here is what we're going to reference when we actually grab our results from this array eventually. This is the literal field name. This is what we're calling it. So you could call this like timestamp field, anything really, but we're going to just keep similar names to avoid confusion. The next is the name of the album, and that's again albums row. We're taking that from here, each result, and that is just name. Then we have the description, and that is equal to albums row description. Ooh, let's just correct that. And then the last one is the image count. So remember, we selected the count of the images on the other table and we called it image count. I'm just going to call this count for now. So that's equal to albums row count, or image count. Okay, so let's just run through this. We've looped through each result that we've got. So however many albums we have, we've looped through. We've then added an array to our main array with this data contained within, and this albums row takes these fields from the database and puts them in here. It's quite hard to understand this concept, particularly if you're new to either arrays or returning values as arrays. However, this is a great way to do things, as you'll see when we implement this in our albums.php. Now we're obviously going to return albums, which is the array that we've created. So we return this value from the function. So the function's grabbing our albums from the database and then returning it as an array. That's essentially all we're doing. Let's go ahead in here and just say print r get albums. So obviously print r is going to show us our array contents. If we go over to Visual Upload and come over to albums.php, okay, so we've got a parse error in albums.php on line 10. Let's go over to line 10. That's there. Okay, so that's because we needed an end tag there and not a start. Okay, so we've printed out the returned results, and when we refresh, oh, we're not logged in. Let's log back in. Okay, and over to albums.php. Okay, so we have currently we have one album, and that has returned an array. We've got the first key is an array, and this contains ID of 55, and that corresponds to this here. We also have a timestamp, which is this, and that corresponds to this just here. We then have a name, which is holiday, which we know, description, which is just some holiday photos, which we know, and count is equal to 0. Because obviously there are no images that correspond to this album. So we've returned this value as an array, and now what we can do is actually use this to output our albums in a format that a user could understand. So the way we do this is we need to set a new variable, and I'm just going to call this albums, and that is equal to get albums. Now what we can do is we can check if this albums array is actually empty. This value here that I've highlighted is now an array because this function returns an array. So what we can do is we can say if empty albums, meaning have no albums been returned from this function because we don't have any albums, then we can echo out you don't, escape that character, have any albums. Okay, otherwise here we do have albums. So if the albums array is empty, tell the user they don't have any albums, otherwise we want to display them here. So let's go ahead and do that. I want to say for each albums as album. Remember, albums is an array, so we can use a for each construct to take each element of this array and create a new element from it. And then we can echo out specific data from here. So just as an example, we could say echo album name. Now the reason we refer to it with name is because this is what we chose when we wrote it here. This is the value that corresponds to here. So now what will happen is when we refresh, you can see that we just get the data holiday back. Now let's go ahead and delete this from the database. So we delete the album from the database, and we'll also need to go ahead and delete this as a folder as well. This won't prevent us from, well, it won't make a difference, but we just want to keep everything tidy while we're developing. Now when we refresh, the albums could not be retrieved from the database. Nothing was retrieved from the database. Therefore, the album that was, or the array that was returned, contains no elements. So we have the error, you don't have any albums.